from the top ones, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. The one on the right is from a recent study on service workers. And I'm not going to go and read all of them. These are just little vignettes to give you a flavor for the kind of thing that I'm interested in. And what I'm interested in are experiences of precarity that we in our current society often see. The Wall Street Journal is a piece about steel workers and the erosion of that industry and the effects that that is having on people who lived in communities where historically they could count on working in the steel industry and now are finding that they no longer can count on that. There's a sense that they have to change their career trajectory just because they can't count that in the future that kind of work will be available. The Washington Post is an article that was, I think it's from last year. Some of you might have read it about the University of Virginia hospital system going after medical debt and bankrupting several families who face really high medical costs. And given the headlines recently, that's a timely one to think about. And then this last one, it's from a study that was conducted on service workers, talking about this, as an example, this woman in California who works for a McDonald's and is getting evicted and finding housing insecurity. So we see in housing, in the labor market, in healthcare, various examples of the kind of insecurity that people are currently facing. And that's why I think thinking about precarity is a timely project. Now, my own relationship to this comes from growing up in Lima, Peru in the 80s and 90s. At the time, Peru was going through two really huge destabilizing forces, terrorism and really high inflation. So for example, when I would go to school, the school bus and other cars that came into the school to do the drop-off would get checked for bombs. So they had those mirrors, with a stick, would check under the car for bombs. And also inflation was a really big destabilizing force. So as I would get my allowance, it would be kind of foolish to save your allowance. So if I wanted to buy, some roller skates, and I thought about how much they cost today, I might try to save up for that amount, but in a few months, that amount wouldn't even get me, maybe like a chocolate bar or something like that. So the sense that you didn't know how to save or what to save for. So there was a lot of precarity, and in my experience growing up in Peru, and to some extent I started to see a similar dynamic at play now having lived in this country for over 20 years. Okay, so I think there are two features or two versions of precarity that we see. One has to do with insecurity, feeling like you're vulnerable to big risks right now. So the healthcare example is one. If you don't have healthcare, if you don't have medical insurance, you might feel like if something were to happen, you're very exposed to the risk that brings into your life. And the other has to do with instability, and it has to do with your projection of whether you're able to meet your needs going forward into the future. So if you're working, say, in the steel industry right now, have a good job with benefits, you might feel fine right now, but if you worry about the industry itself, that it might not survive, that it might shrink, that your job might be replaced by automation, you're worried about the future. So you feel somewhat okay right now, but you're not sure that you'll be able to sustain your current lifestyle going forward. All right. So how should we think about precarity? Now, in the first place, you may think, look, insecurity and instability are just part of what it is to be human, right? Like you might walk outside and get into an accident. We all grow older, grow sick, become dependent. It's just something that we're exposed to as human beings. But I think all kinds of insecurity and instability are not equal, and I think there's a kind of insecurity and instability that concerns, as I think about it, the scaffolds that support our capacity to project ourselves into a future. So I think that the reason we worry about precarity in the job market and health and other kind of foundational aspects of our lives is because insecurity and instability in those really undermines our capacity to project ourselves forward, to plan for the future, to invest in the future, to prioritize the future. Okay, so the way I think about this is that I'm going to call it perspective agency. All that means is that it's your capacity to be an agent prioritizing the future, looking forward. So perspective agency is our capacity to prioritize future-directed ends over more immediate ones. And many values that we care about require that we be able to do this kind of prioritizing. So the best example I can think about as a parent of a 7-year-old is parenting. When the pandemic hit and my daughter was around 3, we were, at home, as a lot of you probably were, and I was trying to teach classes online on Zoom. My husband was trying to work on Zoom as well, and our daughter was just home, right? Now, what would have made everybody happy at the moment or satisfy our immediate ends would have been to me just hand over the iPad and let my daughter watch as much TV on her iPad as she could while we did our jobs, because everybody was we didn't do that. She did watch more TV than probably she should have, but we were trying to prioritize her future well-being, developing into a healthy, well-adjusted kid over our immediate needs, right? Even though in the short term it would have made sense to do that, we thought it didn't make sense on the long term, and we were fortunate enough to be able to prioritize that long-term goal we had over the immediate satisfaction of our needs. The problem with precarity is that it hinders your capacity to do that. It's not that it makes it impossible, but it makes it difficult. If you feel insecure about meeting your basic needs, then you need to prioritize meeting those needs now instead of these future-directed goals. Given that we're beings with limited time, attention, and resources, if right now you're worried about housing, you're worried about your job, you're worried about food, you're going to focus on that, and rationally, rightly so, instead of spending the time, attention on these kind of more far-off ends. And if the future seems uncertain, imagine the steelworker, again, is not sure about their industry or whether it will survive. Your capacity to plan for that future might be hindered because you're not entirely sure what you're planning for. So precarity, I'm going to argue today, hinders our capacity to engage with many of the things that we value precisely because it makes it difficult for us to prioritize those long-term values over more immediate short-term needs. Okay, so that's the kind of first takeaway. The reason that we care about precarity is because there is this thing that as human beings we do, which is engage with these values that are future-directed, and precarity makes it difficult for us to do so. The second kind of big idea I want to put out there is that precarity is not random. So you may think, well, it's just a matter of luck or happenstance that some people experience precarity in their lives. I'm sure most of you, I think, are thinking about stuff in an ethically informed way, so you probably won't jump to that conclusion. But I think it's important to reiterate that the choices we make in terms of the social structure we live in, the institutions and policy design, matter to the degree and spread of precarity. So as an example, think a lot of means-tested benefits that in this country we set aside to target the most needy. Often a lot of them are very bureaucratic, like it's really hard to get the benefit that you're entitled to, and it's really easy to get kicked off. So if you miss a form, if you fill something out incorrectly, if somehow your circumstances change momentarily in terms of you got some extra money for a relative, that can be enough to put you off the rolls and endanger your food stamps or your housing vouchers and so on. That kind of policy design makes it so that even if you get some support because you're in a precarious situation, you can't actually count on it. in the long run. Important to note that these programs are designed that way. That is kind of meant to be the feeling they create, because people who design some of these welfare programs do not want people to become dependent, right? Which creates a kind of instability that thereby hinders capacity to prioritize the future. Okay. The second point to bear in mind here is that the feeling of insecurity and instability can be contagious. In the face of seeing precarity around you, it is often rational to ask, will I be next? And here I have a somewhat disturbing example. So when I was growing up in Peru in the 80s and 90s, I would go with my friends to this district called Miraflores, where there were movie theaters and shops and restaurants and coffee shops. And at one point in the 90s, a car bomb went off. This was one of the most heinous attacks in the city by Sendero Luminoso, the terrorist organization. And thankfully, I wasn't hurt. Nobody in my family was hurt. But what it led to, among many people that lived in the city, was this sense that, like, it could have been me, right? That you could have been there, because many of us had walked that street, many times in our lives, going to the movie theater, going to the park, whatnot. So it created this feeling of insecurity, even for the people who might have felt relatively secure because of their wealth or their where they lived, or the kind of a lot of people actually had security, but it's this feeling that you didn't know this could have happened to you. And so what's important to understand about precarity, I think, is that it's not just about your exposure to risk. It's that if you see lots of people around you, for example, losing their jobs or not being denied healthcare coverage, you start to think, what if that happens to me, right? And that is kind of a rational question to ask, and that leads to you feeling the insecurity and instability, even if you're not being directly affected at the moment. Okay, so that's the three key ideas about precarity. Is that precarity concerns this instability and insecurity about the kind of foundations of how we lead our lives, and I think housing, work, health, that it's not random. There's something about how we organize our institutions that leads to the kind of precarity that we see today, and then the feeling of precarity can spread. Okay, so now you might be thinking, and when I talked about this project with people would say, well, we're talking about inequality. I don't think that's quite right, so that's going to be the more controversial bit that I will talk about today. I'm going to suggest that targeting inequality will not address insecurity and instability, or it's not sufficient. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but it's not enough. So let's think about inequality. Once more here, you see on the right-hand side, that's a photo of Lahaina in Maui, which was devastated by a wildfire a couple of years ago. And on the right-hand side, you see Mark Zuckerberg's face right over the property he bought on another island in Hawaii to build a huge self-sustaining bunker for himself and his family. It has a farm, potable water, an vast underground bunker. It's going to be one of the most expensive properties ever built in the world. And so you might think, here's an example of the inequality of precarity, right? People that are exposed to this risk, they lost their homes, many of them had to rely on FEMA, if you read the stories, like a lot of them a year out were still in insecure housing situations. And then on the right, someone like Zuckerberg, who seems to think that they can protect themselves against the apocalypse or something like that, right? And in a way, what I want to argue is that Mark Zuckerberg is making a mistake in thinking that he actually can protect himself from precarity, because he doesn't fully understand how precarity relies on the connections we have to each other, and it has this kind of spread that he's missing out on. So it's true, the severe inequality threatens security and stability. It creates insecurity and instability. So it erodes civic trust. We are seeing that now, right? That people with immense resources seem to somehow not really be people we can trust to have our best interests at heart. And in part, this is because we think that some, the very wealthy or the very powerful, think that they can opt out of collective solutions to the problems raised by precarity in favor of individual solutions. That's kind of like you might think that the Zuckerberg move, right, is the thought, well, things might get really bad, but I'm going to protect myself. I don't have to invest those immense resources in figuring out a collective solution. I can figure it out for myself, for my family. It also enables relationships of oppression that are inherently unstable, and they create insecurity for those who are subject to them. And I haven't talked a lot about that here, but happy to talk in the discussion. Okay, so why does more equality not necessarily increase safety and security? Now, it's important to understand that inequality is a comparison between two people's relative standing, right? So Zuckerberg has a lot more than the family in Lahaina who just lost their home. That's a clear comparison. But we can all be made more equally precarious. Inequality doesn't tell us what the level is. It just tells us what the comparison is between two people. In the literature and philosophy, this is often called the leveling down objection, that we can all be made more equal by just like lowering everyone's status to the level of poverty or precarity. So more equality does not necessarily mean that we have increased the ability of people to lead good, flourishing lives. We need more than just the thought about equality. And there are many ways of increasing equality, not all of which are sustainable, stable, or secure. And there's another deeper reason, I think, that addressing inequality is not necessarily going to address precarity. Security and stability requires structural and collective solutions, and even if we reduce inequality in income and wealth, this does not guarantee that we thereby enable people to purchase security and stability. Let me just give you a very concrete example. So there has been a move in the past few years to increase the minimum wage for service workers. A move that I completely support and endorse. But one thing that increasing the minimum wage won't necessarily lead to is more stable and secure employment, right? So a lot of what happens in the labor market is that there are many jobs, particularly in the service sector, where people are not guaranteed a number of hours, benefits, or employment going forward, right? So you might be working for a Starbucks or Walmart and be told, well, next week, there's going to be a lot of customers. So you're going to get, 30 hours, 40 hours. But the following week, maybe the week after New Year's, there's just not that many people coming in. So now you're going to get 5 hours or 10 hours. That means that you can't actually count on having a certain amount of income coming in every month, right? So that kind of instability has to do with the quality of the work that is available, has to do a lot with labor law and the kind of protections we have for workers. Increasing the minimum wage might make you better off in some respects, but it's not going to address the quality of that work. If there are, for someone of your educational level, no stable forms of employment, you might not be able to get that, even with a higher wage. So we can talk more about that in Q&A, but that's an example, I think, of how we have to think beyond just the distribution of the dollars, but actually about the quality of the kind of work that is available. Okay, so the central question that I'm concerned with right now is how to think about forging stability and security in our current time. Now, you might go back to something you recognize, that's Hobbes. And Hobbes is perhaps infamous for arguing in favor of a strong and authoritarian monarchy, definitely not the argument I want to make. But what Hobbes really understood was the problem, I think. Hobbes was born in the 16th century, lived into the 17th century at a very tumultuous time in Britain. In fact, he said in his autobiography that when he was born, there was rumors going around that the Spanish Armada was going to invade Britain, and that his mother was so afraid that she went into labor. And there he was, he said, it was born, me and my fear were born on that day, right? Fear was the animating force of Hobbes' political philosophy. And I'm not going to read this whole passage, it's one of the most famous passages of Leviathan. But what Hobbes notices there is that without security and stability, there's no place, he says, for industry because the fruits thereof are uncertain. No culture, no navigation, no use of commodities, no building, and Hobbes was a big fan of architecture, no knowledge, no arts, no letters. So much of what we value and makes our distinct human accomplishments depend on being able to project ourselves in the future with some confidence that the work we put in now will lead to some outcome down the line. It's not just something that we do as individuals, but it's something that we do together. We want to be able to count that if us together are embarking on a project, we can sort of see and predict that the steps from here to there that we can take steps that will get us there. And if we are in a very insecure and unstable environment, as Hobbes was during the Civil War in England, then that relationship starts to become eroded and people start thinking about just satisfying their more immediate needs and not really thinking going forward. Okay, so as I said, I don't agree with the authoritarian solution, though I saw it in my own life growing up in Peru, how quickly insecurity and instability can lead to that kind of authoritarianism. This is President Fujimori, who was president in Peru in the 90s. And what Fujimori did was run an authoritarian government on the basis of his ability to address the needs for insecurity and for security and stability that the population demanded. So on April 5th, 1992, he dissolved Congress because he said it was getting in the way of him being able to do what he needed to do. There were troops on the streets. What was interesting, though, to me, reflecting back, is not that this happened. If you live in Latin America, it's not going to come. It was how divided people were over what happened, right? So in my family still, there are the pro-Fujimori and anti-Fujimori. It's like a big, deep division. Because people felt like things were so insecure and unstable that we needed that strong hand, someone to kind of put order in. And if you were living at that time in that moment, it really was not hard to see how you could easily be persuaded into that view. Things were not as clear that this was obviously bad or obviously the right thing. Many people had very conflicted feelings, including many people in my family. And so I saw firsthand how if there's enough insecurity and instability, someone that comes in, as Fujimori did, and really does establish a kind of order, that can be quite appealing. So what are the problems with that solution? That may seem obvious. I think the problem is that you trade one source of instability for another, right? You trade the instability of, at the time, terrorism, inflation, for that of the authoritarian. And in fact, what happens was that Fujimori ended up getting engaged in corruption. It led to a lot of instability in his own government, and eventually led to his downfall. There's also a lack of systematic responsiveness to people's needs when you have a government that's very top-down, right? There's not a lot of bottom-up feedback that happens in that kind of situation. Most obvious problem is that you must resort to violent repressive methods to maintain power, which makes that government often illegitimate. And I think from the perspective of the project I'm interested in, which is stability and security, these are all potential sources of further instability and insecurity in people's lives. Okay. Now, am I just arguing for safety nets? And think, well, that's the way to address this kind of insecurity. And I think there's something obviously appealing about the view that material security can be addressed through social services, which act as a safety net. Obviously in Europe, in Sweden and Norway and Scandinavia, there's a robust safety net that provides a kind of security for people. And often the solution focuses on redistribution to those who are currently most insecure, the most vulnerable in our society. But I think there are problems with this solution too, as stated in any case. And it's a problem that I think we're currently kind of grappling with. It doesn't address the question of how to build broad, sustained support, which is critical to the long-term stability required to address precarity. So if a particular administration comes in and says, we're going to address poverty and precarity, and we're going to institute these policies, but there's a predictable backlash against those policies, such that in the next administration those things taken away or get gutted, there's a sense in which as a recipient you can't really count on that source of support for yourself. I think that the focus on the most vulnerable can lead to divisive policies that risk alienating swaths of the population whose support is often critical to the long-term sustainability and stability of the system. Because remember, it's not just about insecurity now, but future stability, right? You want to count on that help, that support, those institutions being here, not just now, but going forward. That's what enables you to look forward and plan. So by focusing on those who are presently vulnerable, we risk ignoring vulnerabilities that might arise from not considering how to build and sustain long-term sustainability and stability. So I think that the problem is not just about how to address insecurity now, but how to do so in a way that gets us long-term stability. And for that, I think we need to do some reimagining of what security and stability looks like. So as I see it, the models is a kind of authoritarian model. I will establish security and stability for you, don't worry about it. It's not the best model. And the second model is like we have this safety net, this targeting of resources to the most vulnerable. The problem as we see is that people often end up failing to support those programs in the long run. And so we have these very bureaucratic safety net systems that try to kind of compromise on some of the pushback they get by targeting aid towards the needy, but then making it really hard to get it, make it really hard to not lose it, or making it too easy to lose it, and so on. So I think the threat of increasing precarity has magnified the ways in which our fates are increasingly intertwined, and the importance of our need for security and stability. And I think we're taking labor, housing, health, and environmental policy with an eye to that security and stability is an important first step. But unless we address this issue of social trust and social cohesion, which in some way is the thing that gets us stability going forward, that we all buy into the project of what we're doing and are continually motivated to keep supporting it, we're going to keep facing precarity, unfortunately. All right, so that's all I have, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. All right, let's get started.
Yeah, what do you think about universal basic income as a way to reduce precarity?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is this recent book, The Guarantee, which makes a case for beyond even universal basic income, housing, and so on. I think there are maybe two ways to think about universal basic income. There's one source of support for universal basic income that would use it as an excuse to erode other kind of institutions that we have to support, let's say, education and healthcare, right? So the idea, Charles Murray and some conservatives have in the past supported universal basic income as a way to say, well, it's up to you what you do with this, like, money from the government, but we're not going to provide these other sources of support. I think that kind of model I don't particularly like, and I worry a little bit that universal basic income would be the thing that wouldn't be given in addition to support for education or roads, but instead of. But I do think universal basic income, can be helpful if we keep in mind that some of the policies we need, like, for example, better legal protection policies, also need to happen at the same time. That it can't be kind of the only solution or the panacea, because some of the ways in which we build stability and security is actually by building institutions that are stable in the long term and that provide that kind of security to people. And those institutions depend on social support, on social cohesion, and I'm not entirely sure universal basic income would get us all of those things. So I'm a little bit mixed on it, but I'm happy to hear from other people. Yes.
Wait,
Oh.
please. I've been negligent.
Oh, yeah, okay, good. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask about something else, but Stan's point about the UBI is really good, and the opposing idea is that, oh, if you give people universal basic income, you're going to take away medical benefits and Social Security and all these other things. And I don't think that's fair. There's these posts that I see on social media all the time. Oh, the government spends money on this, but it doesn't have enough money to spend on that. And it sounds like it's a kind of thing of that form. There's another really difficult thing that comes from precarity, and that's stress. And, thank you. And it's not just stress of one day. It's chronic stress. And that level of chronic stress builds up in our bodies. And when we're dealing with people who have been suffering from a life of living on the edge, I'm trying not to hear that hip-hop song every time I say it. When we're dealing with such people, or are such people ourselves, that stress is really changing how they function in the world.
Yeah.
In all kinds of ways that just come up in surprising ways that we may not even associate with precarity.
Yeah, I think that's such an important consideration, that there is this, when you're constantly worried about the now and the present and just making it through, there's a way in which your body is being affected, not just, your mind, and thinking forward. And I think for some of us who still remember the early days of the pandemic, remember that sort of anxiety in our bodies, right? About being kind of scared about what was happening. And so, yeah, I agree completely.
Question from Zoom?
I think I heard something.
I can just speak up. Thank you.
No.
Yes.
One person here. One person.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I was really interested in and I agree with what you brought up about civic trust kind of being the undergirding of like a truly successful and stable governmental approach to disability. Yeah, flipping it on myself then. But I feel like I've seen, I always hear these examples of really strong political structures like in Scandinavia that allow for these sort of like not just the safety net, like you said, but they have that kind of trust in government. And I wonder how much of a barrier you see the diversity of a country like the U.S.
Yeah.
As being, as opposed to maybe what they're dealing with over yonder, and how we can kind of maintain our diversity and enormity as a country, but still work toward building that civic trust and see ourselves as part of one group.
Yeah, thank you. I think you put the finger on the problem, the distinctively American problem. So I don't think you can, I mean, some of you might just come and say, we're going to do Scandinavian style. So I just don't think you would get the social cohesion, social trust support for that just out of the blue. It's a question of how we get to build something like that kind of social trust. And this is a huge and diverse country, right? And so I'm still kind of puzzling over that part of the puzzle. And I'm curious, as some of you are, about examples of places where it goes well, where people have built kind of social trust in institutions. So if you look at surveys of Americans, like the institutions they most trust, can anybody guess what's at the top? It's actually the Parks Department, interestingly enough. But pretty high up there is another one of my favorites, which is libraries, public libraries. And I think public libraries, and Eric Heinenberg at NYU has done research on this, on how public libraries manage to build kind of social solidarity in communities. And they also are institutions that generally are pretty revered. And so I think they offer a kind of interesting model of how you might end up going to the library because, I don't know, you need a book, you need a place to study, you need a place to work. But if you become a library goer, there's a way in which the initial impetus that got you there is far outstripped by what you find in being part of a kind of public institution that's there. And people go to libraries for all sorts of different reasons. Not everybody goes for the same reason. And so there's a way in which libraries are a nice model of building institutions that have social support from different kinds of people that have different kinds of needs, and that see in the institution something different, but see it as a source of public good. And I think we need more examples of institutions like that. I think public schools, to some extent, though they're often a site of controversy, can have some of that, but yeah, I think what we need to think about is like, what institutions actually work to do that within the American context of huge diversity and differences of opinion, but having people come together. And some of our fanciful moments, or maybe just from living in Philadelphia for a while, I still think like sports team loyalty can sometimes do that. Like it can actually make people connect across difference in an interesting way. So anyway, that's all very speculative.
Thanks. Hi. So I'm pretty unsettled by what I heard today, but so I'm having a hard time getting my thoughts together. But I have been a minimum wage activist, and as you may know, in Pennsylvania, it is $7.25, which is the most immoral, horrible thing that you can actually imagine for people working down at that end.
Yeah.
So, and I understand that things shift in society. I mean, you know, look at how we have, you know, turned into this tech savvy. Okay, if you want a job now, you got to know what you're doing in the tech world and, you know, medical world, whatever. And a lot of people just, because of a lot of different factors, just can't get there.
Yeah.
So, I feel like unions, and you started out with talking about service workers, that unions are very important, hold a very important function here.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like thinking about overall, the trend is that wealth is bubbling up to the top. Precarity is, you know, more and more people are feeling very precarious. Look at how folks are feeling in Chinatown right now. So you know, it's just like, you know, what are the big solutions here?
Yeah.
When the public education in Philadelphia is, you know, I wouldn't go to a school where I saw rats running across the floor, which I've heard happens. You know what I'm saying? So it's just, you know, the housing is a huge problem right now. People are getting gentrified out of their neighborhoods and homes. So it's just,
I agree.
I'm like, you know, like, okay, so what
Yeah.
do we do?
Yeah,
I mean, really,
it can feel pretty dismal.
Yeah, in a big systemic way,
Yeah,
what would be your first move?
right. So that's probably way beyond my philosopher pay role, but let me just say a couple of things. I think that the union is a good example, and one thing to remember about unions, and to think about unions, is they often don't fight just for pay, right? But for job security, for retirement benefits, for a whole host of other parts of labor conditions that are sustainable, you know, that lead to people having careers where they can imagine moving forward, what their lives will look like down the line, what retirement will look like, and so on. The one worry I have about, and I used to work at CUNY and was a member of a union for many years. The union was great. You know, I think that's a model that works to create those kind of labor conditions. But there is one worry I have about, in this broad systemic way, thinking about the union model as the model, which is that if you understand the history of things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security in this country, is that benefits tied to work have broad support, and have historically been the ones that people are most against, you know, losing. And so you have candidates who run to protect Social Security, to protect Medicare. The benefits that have to do with targeting poverty, with what you might think of people who are don't have those security and maybe are not in the workforce and so on, have often been the target of a lot of backlash and a lot of kind of political animus. And so there's a way in which the safety net in this country really is two, one for workers and one for the other people who are in that situation because of poverty or some other. And you have a lot of support for one and not as much support for the other. And so I worry about trying to organize around security and stability solely through work, because this gives people an incentive in a sense that what they should be fighting for are benefits for workers. But there are people that, for whatever reason, whether it's disability or they're taking care of a child at home or whatever, that's not the way that they can access security and stability. So I would think we need a movement that's broader than that, that's broader than it just being tied to work. But I think unions are, you know, an interesting model to think about how to accomplish that.
Do you have any suggestions for how the Philadelphia Ethical Society as an organization can promote the kind of social stability that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm curious. I think part of it is that we, as a society, need to think more about how do we create, the way I think about it is almost like attachment to the kind and trust in the institutions that can do some of the work of providing security and stability. And I think community organizations like this one are an important model, right? It's like, I'm sure you all seem very different. You probably come from different places, different spaces. You're talking to each other. You're engaging in conversations. I think that is kind of a fruitful model for how to think about going forward. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that when we only talk about inequality, I think sometimes we miss this important dimension that I'm trying to highlight today. And so I think inequality is an important piece of the puzzle, but not the only one. And I think it's a piece, as I see it in the discourse, sometimes we're not really addressing the needs that some people have, because we tend to conflate them with inequality and not think about them as different needs, which is a need to have a security and stability that you can plan for the future, that you can imagine your future, that you can invest in that future.
Just another something to consider here. I don't know if any other countries or municipalities do something like this, but in Japan they have a benevolent tax system called furatsu noze, which is a system where a very small percentage of your taxes that you would otherwise pay, you can designate for a specific location or service. So what likely often happens is people will move into the city and therefore their tax dollars aren't going to their hometown anymore. It's kind of crumbling infrastructure. And so they'll pay a small portion, they'll be able to autonomously choose a small portion of their taxes to go to this particular place. I wonder if perhaps Philadelphia could benefit from something like this, where, instead of the homestead exemption, right, where we're actually just getting a tax break, we can instead have a choice over where our taxes are being spent, a very small percentage of what we would otherwise already be paying.
Right. That is an interesting idea.
Anyone else? That's it.
Okay, actually, is this on? Okay, religious organizations of which we are one, even though we are non-theists, we're not really a community organization. But I wanted to point to the program that Trinity Church around the corner around Rittenhouse Square has, where it provides food and clothing to a wide range of people who are insecure. And those, we had their minister here a couple of weeks ago to talk about their program. I think that's a good example.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. And let me just say that historically, so the time that Hobbes was writing, the place to get this kind of cohesion, to address the needs of people who are insecure was the church, right? So the church still does, but used to much more widely do this, which is that people went to church for spiritual salvation, for community, but the church also often, most churches provided food, clothing, sometimes shelter for people who needed it. And that was a mechanism of redistribution in a way, right? From people who could afford to, their parishioners, to people who needed it, packaged in one institution, the church. And then that, obviously, there has been an erosion of those sorts of institutions. And so the mechanisms we have for them, at least in this country, often are places where only the poor will go to get what they need, but not where people who are well off and in poverty are mingling with each other. And I think it's important to think about how that mingling with each other creates support for the institution. Right? So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm curious, but this goes to Kate's point about the big, if we had a wand, what could we do with these big structural questions. For me, it's always money in politics and campaign finance reform. That would be the one thing that could unlock some of these more majoritarian institutions that we think we could build. And I'm curious I work on a concept called citizens' assemblies, which brings randomly selected people together, try to diversify the people who are in the room, and get money out of the process. Yeah. I'm curious if have you ever been involved in those sort of deliberative forums that try to bring forward a majoritarian policy proposal?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I haven't been involved, though I do know some of that work in political philosophy on autocracy, which is basically the idea that you have decision makers randomly selected from the population, so you kind of break the link between powerful, wealthy people that try to influence legislators. And I think that is an interesting thing to think about, an interesting proposal. And in particular, I am interested in this question of how you build social trust, right, in government institutions, in social institutions, and cultural institutions. I think that is what we're feeling we don't have enough of. People on both sides, I think. An important kind of other bit to think about too is there's been a big rural-urban divide in the most recent elections, and the sense that rural communities kind of see things differently, right? The people who are living in urban communities like ours. And if you read some of the research done on rural communities, it really is striking how many of the social institutions have been eroded. A lot of the poorest zip codes in the United States are actually rural places. And in many of those, they used to be company towns, where there'd be like the steel mill or whatever, and a lot of the amenities surrounded that industry. So those industries would invest in like a community center, restaurants, and other kinds of organizations to keep the people working in the company happy and whatever, productive. And when those industries left, all of those places, we call third places, were gone as well in many of those cases. There's this great book by Catherine Eden, a sociologist at Princeton, about the poorest. It's called Injustice of Place. And you see how in these rural towns, a lot of there just isn't a lot to do, because these places kind of disappeared, right? Because they depended on these industries that invested in them, and when they left, they weren't there. And so it's not, when you read it, it's not surprising that there isn't a lot of this kind of social cohesion, perhaps, or social trust, when those key institutions have basically been destroyed by, in part, globalization. So.
As I was hearing you go through your concept of precariity, and it was sort of my first time thinking about it in that way, with the sub-buckets that you laid out of not only economic, but also like feeling safe, feeling, probably loved, feeling like you have a purpose, etc. I started to think as your presentation went on that, oh, this is actually the underlying incentive that we have in capitalism. This is what we're chasing. We talk about it as like money, and we talk about it as that being a financial incentive. But what we're really doing with that money is we're either plugging that low-income precarity or plugging that feeling of people love and respect me. I truly don't think anyone is working more for $20 million than they are for $10 million because they really want that X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I think they're plugging a hole, plugging that, whatever it is, that feeling of want to be important or want to have, want to have some sort of place in this world. But yeah, I really thought of the end-to-end of economic experience, and I thought, yeah, it is precariety that gets us to work. It is precariety that might be driving the system, whether it's the precariety of I'm going to get food on the table on one end, of the precariety of, hey, I'm going to be someone and I'm going to be loved on the other end.
Yeah.
But that might be turning this whole, it might be the thing that's turning this whole system here.
Yeah.
And so the idea of reducing precariety when we have this system that almost relies on it for our overall stability,
yeah.
I almost felt like how do you start to reduce the precariety when the system that benefits from it is steering the whole ship? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think you're totally spot on. That's very insightful. It's interesting to look back. Philosopher Elizabeth Anderson has this book about the history of work. And in part it's about the history of the poor laws, right? The poor laws in Victorian England. And you see in the text of the legislators that put forward these views, that exact same sentiment. They said, we can't actually address poverty because then why would people work, right? That was the kind of logic of the whole thing. But then, what she points out is that so much of what we see right now as industry and technological developments, as you said, the person who's $10 million working for the $20 million, in some sense doesn't really depend on them feeling precarious. It depends on something else. I think we kind of need to separate the sense of I think people, if they're working towards something, and I think that's what kind of Hobbes understood, if you're working towards something and you're looking to the future, people like to see the fruits of their labor pay off, even if they're not worried about, putting food on the table. But I do think that you're right, that there is this kind of systematic assumption that we make, that without that fear, people wouldn't do the things that need to be done.
Anyone else?
Thank you, everyone. This is fantastic. That's so much. One last.
It kind of follows on to what was just being discussed, but I'm curious though that for people who then are satisfied and then maybe choose not to have enough to live on, and that would then reduce the supply of workers, therefore,
Right.
hopefully, the demand would increase to then maybe make that better off for those who do still need to work.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting, well, we haven't tried it, right, making people unafraid of whether they need to meet their basic needs. I think you probably think that Scandinavian example might be one example the closest, and what seems like people still go to work. I don't know, yeah, so. Thank you, everyone.
Well, that's it for today, here, at least in our platform. Thanks for coming, and come back and see us again.